Hello everyone and thank you for joining me. My name is Catherine and I'm 45 years old. At least, I was 45 when my life as I knew it imploded in the most spectacular, soul-crushing way imaginable. I never thought the day my husband of 2 decades walked out our front door for the last time would be the first step on a path that would lead me to a boardroom where I held his entire professional future in the palm of my hand. It's a strange and winding road that leads from heartbreak to power. And mine was stranger than most. Before I dive into how I went from a discarded wife to the woman my ex-husband had to answer to, I'd love to know where you're all watching from today, so please drop a comment down below. And if you've ever felt underestimated or had to completely reinvent your life, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new viewers here, make sure you subscribe to join our community of survivors and storytellers. Now let's get into it. What would you do if the man who shattered your world suddenly became your subordinate, and you had the power to sign his pink slip? For 20 years, my life had been a carefully curated collection of predictable comforts. Richard and I had built what I believed was a fortress of a marriage, brick by brick, year by year. We met in business school, two ambitious minds with matching 5-year plans. He was charming, with a quick laugh and a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. I was the quieter one, the strategist, the one who saw the angles he missed. We were a team. After we got our MBAs, his career took off first, a steep, glittering trajectory in finance that demanded long hours, endless travel, and a certain kind of social grace at corporate events that I happened to possess in spades. It was an unspoken agreement, one that solidified over time, that I would step back from my own ambitions to support his. Just for a few years, we'd said, until we're established. Few years turned into 5, then 10. We had a beautiful home in a leafy suburb, the kind with a wraparound porch and a garden I poured my soul into. I managed our lives with the precision of a Fortune 500 CEO. I orchestrated the renovations, managed the investments, planned the dinner parties that greased the wheels of his promotions, and remembered the names and allergies of every one of his colleagues' spouses. I was the silent partner in the firm of Richard's success. And for a long time I convinced myself that was enough. Felt important. I was contributing. I remembered one specific evening, maybe 12 years into our marriage. I'd been headhunted for a senior marketing position at a major firm. It was a thrilling opportunity, a chance to finally step back into the world I'd left behind. I brought it up to Richard over a bottle of wine, my hands trembling slightly as I held the printout of the job description. He read it, a thoughtful frown on his face. "Wow, Kat. This is really something," he said, but his tone was off. It wasn't excitement. It was something else, something I couldn't quite place. "But the travel," he continued, tapping the paper. "And the hours. How would we manage? The house, my events. It would be a lot to juggle." He framed it all as a question of logistics, of our shared comfort. He spoke of our life, the one he was the face of and I was the engine for. "I just worry you'd be stretched so thin, honey. You're already doing so much for us." I looked around at the perfectly appointed living room, at the life I had so meticulously built, and I folded. He was right, I told myself. It would be too much. I sent a polite email declining the interview the next day. Chose us. I chose the life we had built. I buried that flicker of personal ambition under another layer of domestic duty, another brick in the fortress I thought was protecting me. The drift was subtle, a slow erosion I didn't notice until the foundations were gone. The conversations became shorter, the shared jokes less frequent. He was on his phone more, a small private smile playing on his lips as he scrolled through things he never shared. When I'd ask what was so interesting, he'd just wave a hand dismissively. "Just stupid stuff. You wouldn't get it." He started staying late at the office more often, citing projects I'd never heard of. He bought new clothes, started going to a different, more expensive gym. They were all small changes, tiny red flags that, in isolation, seemed insignificant. But together they were weaving a new narrative, one I was being written out of. I tried to bridge the gap. I'd suggest date nights, weekend trips, the things we used to love. He'd agree, but with a sigh, as if I were adding another tedious task to his to-do list. The fortress was still standing, but the inside was cold and empty. I was living with a polite, handsome stranger who paid the bills. The day it all came down was a Tuesday in October. The air was crisp, and the leaves in my garden were a riot of gold and crimson. I was in the kitchen, pulling a tray of roasted chicken from the oven, the scent of rosemary filling the air. It was Richard's favorite. He walked in, not in his usual work suit, but in a new, slim-fit jacket I'd never seen before. He didn't even glance at the meal I'd prepared. He just stood there in the entryway between the kitchen and the hall, his hands shoved in his pockets. "Cat," he said, and the sound of my name in his mouth was so flat, so devoid of warmth, that a cold dread washed over me. He knew. Before another word was spoken, I knew. "We need to talk," he said, the four most terrifying words in the English language. I turned off the oven and wiped my hands on my apron, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. We sat at the polished oak dining table, the table where we'd hosted countless holidays and dinner parties. He couldn't look me in the eye. He stared at a spot on the wall just over my shoulder. "I'm not happy, Cat," he began. The cliché of it was almost laughable. It was a line from a bad movie. "I haven't been happy for a long time." He spoke for what felt like an hour, in a long, rambling monologue of self-pity and justification. He talked about feeling stagnant, about wanting more from life, about feeling like he was playing a role. He never once mentioned my role, my happiness, my life. It was all about him, his needs, his feelings, his midlife crisis, gift-wrapped in therapeutic jargon. "I've met someone," he finally said, the words dropping into the silent room like stones into a well. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a clock we'd bought together on our 10th anniversary. "Who?" I whispered, my voice a dry rasp. He finally looked at me then, a flicker of something. Was it guilt? Or was it excitement? In his eyes. "Her name is Tiffany," he said. She's amazing, Cat. She's so full of life. She makes me feel young again." He said it with a genuine foolish grin on his face, the grin of a man utterly besotted, completely oblivious to the devastation he was causing. The name didn't register at first. And then a horrible, dawning realization. Tiffany Vance. I'd seen her on his laptop screen. A 25-year-old girl with a cascade of blonde hair, a perpetually pouting mouth, and millions of followers who watched her unbox luxury handbags and document her brunches. She was an influencer, an occupation Richard had sneered at not 6 months prior, calling it the vapid pursuit of the terminally self-obsessed. "Tiffany Vance?" I asked, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. "The girl who posts pictures of her avocado toast." His face flushed. "Don't be like that, Cat. She's more than that. She's smart, she's ambitious." I just stared at him, the man I had spent half my life with. The man for whom I had sacrificed my own ambitions. He was leaving me, his partner of 20 years, for a girl young enough to be our daughter, a girl whose entire career was built on the kind of superficiality he had always claimed to despise. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. He was trading our shared history, our inside jokes, our 2 decades of life, for a cheap, shiny facsimile of youth and relevance. He wasn't just leaving me. He was erasing me, replacing our entire life with something new, trendy, and disposable. "I've already packed a bag," he said, standing up. "I'll have my lawyer contact yours about the arrangements." And with that, he walked out the door, leaving me alone at the giant oak table with a roasted chicken cooling on the counter, and the ruins of my life scattered around me like shattered glass. The first few weeks were a blur of numb disbelief. The house, once my sanctuary, became a cavernous, echoing prison. Every object held a memory, every room a ghost. I'd find one of his stray socks under the bed and dissolve into tears. The silence was the worst part. For 20 years, the house had been filled with the rhythm of our life together. His heavy footsteps on the stairs, the sound of the television in the evenings, the low murmur of his voice on the phone. Now, there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic beating of my own heart. The financial reality hit me like a second wave of a tsunami. Richard, guided by his new life and his lawyer, was brutally efficient. The joint accounts were frozen. A laughably low offer of alimony was made, an amount that barely covered the mortgage on the house he had so eagerly abandoned. He was cutting me off not just emotionally, but financially, trying to untangle his life from mine with the cold precision of a surgeon. My friends, bless them, tried their best. They brought over casseroles and bottles of wine. They sat with me while I cried, offering platitudes that felt both kind and useless. "You're better off without him," they'd say. "He's a fool." But I could see the pity in their eyes, the slight discomfort. I was a cautionary tale now, the woman whose husband had traded her in for a younger model. I was a walking, talking cliché. I tried talking to my mother about it on the phone one afternoon, desperate for some unconditional support. Her response was a bucket of ice water. "Well, Catherine," she'd said, her voice laced with a familiar, weary disappointment, "you did let yourself get comfortable. Men need to feel admired, you know. You can't just be a manager." The implication was clear. It was my fault. I hadn't been interesting enough, attentive enough, young enough. I hadn't managed him properly. The conversation ended with me hanging up, my hand shaking, feeling more alone than ever before. Not only had my husband abandoned me, but my own mother saw it as a failure on my part. When the initial shock wore off, a terrifying panic set in. Had to work. I hadn't had a formal job in 20 years. My MBA felt like a relic from another lifetime. I updated my resume, the huge gap between my last position and the present day glaring at me like a wound. I started applying for jobs, sending my resume out into the digital void. The few responses I got were for interviews that were exercises in thinly veiled ageism. I'd sit across from interviewers half my age who would look at my resume and ask, "So what have you been doing for the last 20 years? As if raising a family and managing a complex household were a long, luxurious vacation. They'd ask about my proficiency with the latest software, my experience with new marketing metrics, and my eyes would glaze over. The world had moved on and I had been standing still. One particularly brutal interview ended with a young man, who couldn't have been more than 30, telling me with a condescending smile, "We're really looking for someone with more current experience. Someone who is a digital native." I walked out of that office and into the bustling city street, feeling invisible, obsolete. I sat in my car in the parking garage and wept, not just for the loss of my marriage, but for the loss of myself. I was 45 years old, and I had been completely and utterly erased. I hit my breaking point a week after that disastrous interview. I was sitting on my living room floor, surrounded by bills, a foreclosure notice from the bank lying ominously on top of the pile. Richard had stopped paying the mortgage as a negotiation tactic. I was about to lose my home. I was staring at my reflection in the dark screen of the television, a pale, tear-streaked woman I barely recognized. And then my best friend, Sarah, let herself in. She didn't say a word. She just sat down on the floor next to me, took the foreclosure notice from my hands and tore it in half. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "This is not how your story ends. He does not get to do this to you." Sarah had been my rock. She was a self-made woman, a graphic designer who had built her own successful agency from the ground up. She had never approved of the way I had sublimated my life for Richard's. "Do you remember that woman from business school?" she asked softly. "The one who aced her finance exams. The one who could build a business plan in her sleep. Where did she go, Kat?" Her words were like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 2 decades. Something inside me shifted. A tiny, ember-like flicker of the old Catherine, the ambitious, sharp-witted woman I used to be, began to glow. Sarah was right. I had been trying to fit myself back into a world that no longer had a space for me. I was trying to play by their rules, the rules of a game that was rigged against me. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface of my grief began to boil. I wasn't obsolete. I was experienced. I had spent 20 years as a project manager, a financial planner, a crisis coordinator, and a chief operating officer of a complex domestic enterprise. I just hadn't been getting a paycheck for it. I stood up, a new resolve hardening in my bones. "You're right," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "I need to stop asking for a seat at their table. I need to build my own." That night I didn't sleep. Fueled by coffee and a righteous fury, I turned my dining room into a war room. I unearthed my old MBA textbooks. I spent hours online, devouring articles on modern business strategy, catching up on 2 decades of innovation. The language was new, but the principles were the same. The world hadn't changed as much as I thought. It had just learned new buzzwords. I saw a niche. Small to medium-sized businesses, the ones that couldn't afford a huge consulting firm like a Bain or McKinsey, but were struggling with the same problems of inefficiency, poor cash flow, and lack of strategic direction. I could be their solution. I spent the next 2 weeks in a creative frenzy. I drained a portion of my dwindling savings to create a professional website. I called myself the K.L. Evans Group. Using my maiden name felt like reclaiming a part of myself I had given away. I crafted my story not as a weakness, but as a unique strength. 20 years of hands-on management experience in a high-pressure, dynamic environment. It was true after all. My first client was a local bakery, owned by a sweet, flustered woman named Maria who made the best sourdough in the state but was on the verge of bankruptcy. She was my guinea pig. I went in and observed her operation for a week. I charted her workflow, analyzed her supply costs, and talked to her employees. She was over-ordering ingredients, leading to massive waste. Her staffing schedule was inefficient, causing her to pay overtime she couldn't afford. Her marketing was non-existent. I built her a simple, elegant plan. A new inventory system, a restructured schedule, and a local social media campaign. I showed her how to use free online tools to manage it all. It was the kind of logistical puzzle I used to solve every day when juggling school schedules, sports practices, and Richard's chaotic travel itinerary. Within a month, Maria called me, crying with relief. Her food costs were down by 30%, and she'd had her most profitable weekend ever. She paid my modest invoice and gave me a testimonial that glowed with gratitude. That first success was the proof I needed. It wasn't a fluke. I had the skills. I took Maria's testimonial and used it to land a second client, a mid-sized plumbing supply company. This one was tougher. The owner, a gruff man named Frank, was old school and deeply skeptical of a female consultant he'd found on the internet. His warehouse was a chaotic mess, and his 2 sons, who were supposed to be managing it, were more interested in their fantasy football league than in inventory turnover. The resistance was palpable. One of the sons, a cocky 20-something named Leo, openly challenged me in a team meeting. "With all due respect, Mrs. Evans," he'd said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk, "my dad and I have been doing this a long time. I don't think some charts and graphs are going to change anything." Instead of getting angry, I got specific. I pulled up the security camera footage from the loading dock, which I'd been reviewing. I pointed to 3 instances from that morning alone where his employees couldn't find the right parts, wasting a combined 45 minutes of labor. Then I pulled up their fuel logs and showed them how their delivery trucks were crossing paths all day, driving up fuel costs because of a lack of route planning. "That 45 minutes of wasted time cost you $95 in labor, Leo," I said calmly. "And the poor route planning is costing you nearly $400 a week in gas. That's $20,000 a year. My charts and graphs are just a picture of the money you're setting on fire." The smirk vanished from Leo's face. His father, Frank, just stared at me, a new respect dawning in his eyes. I spent a month reorganizing their warehouse, implementing a digital tracking system, and redesigning their delivery logistics. I didn't just save them money. I settled a brewing family feud by giving the sons clear roles and responsibilities. Frank became my biggest advocate. He started recommending me to his contacts in the local business community. Slowly but surely, the K.L. Evans Group started to gain a reputation. I was the turnaround artist, the efficiency expert. I moved out of my dining room and into a small rented office space. I hired a part-time assistant. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something. I was Catherine Lynn Evans again. I was in control. My confidence, so long dormant, began to bloom. I found a new rhythm to my life, one that was entirely my own. One afternoon, about a year and a half after Richard had left, I was in my office reviewing a financial statement when the phone rang. The caller ID was a name I didn't recognize. Arthur Vance. The name sent a small, unpleasant jolt through me. It's the same last name as Tiffany, Richard's influencer child bride. It had to be a coincidence, I told myself. It was a common enough name. "This is Catherine Evans," I answered, my voice professional and steady. The voice on the other end was gravelly, stressed, and accustomed to being in charge. "Miss Evans, my name is Arthur Vance. I'm the owner of Vance Manufacturing. I was given your name by Frank Peterson. He says you work miracles." I could hear the desperation under the gruff exterior. Vance Manufacturing. I knew the name. They were a major player in the region, an old-school industrial giant that had been around for generations. I also knew, from the business pages, that they were in serious trouble. Foreign competition and a failure to modernize had hit them hard. "I'm not a miracle worker, Mr. Vance," I replied, keeping my tone even. "I just provide a clear analysis and actionable strategies." "That's what I need," he barked. "Clarity. My company is bleeding, and my board is full of yes-men who are afraid to tell me how bad it is. I need someone to come in, take a hard look at the books, and tell me who and what to cut to stop the hemorrhaging. No sentiment, no politics, just the bottom line. I'll give you full autonomy." The offer was huge, a major leap for my small firm. But the name still bothered me. "Mr. Vance," I said carefully, "before we go any further, I feel I should ask. Are you by any chance related to a Tiffany Vance?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "She's my daughter," he said, his voice tight. "Why?" My heart started to beat a little faster. This wasn't a coincidence. This was fate, with a wicked sense of humor. "No reason," I lied smoothly. "Just a name I recognized. Tell me more about the challenges you're facing at Vance Manufacturing." We talked for another hour. He laid out the grim situation. He was a proud man being forced to admit failure, and his desperation was a tangible thing, even over the phone. He never once mentioned his daughter again, and he certainly never mentioned a son-in-law. By the end of the call, we had an agreement. He was hiring me. The K.L. Evans Group was about to take on its biggest client yet. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. The father of the woman who had destroyed my life was hiring me to save his. The first day at Vance Manufacturing felt like stepping onto a battlefield. I had spent the entire weekend preparing, poring over the preliminary financials Arthur had sent over. They were worse than he had let on. The company wasn't just bleeding, it was hemorrhaging from a dozen different wounds. I chose my outfit with the care of a general selecting his armor. A charcoal gray power suit, sharp and impeccably tailored, a crisp white silk blouse, and heels that were high enough to command respect but low enough to stride purposefully through a factory if I needed to. My hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. There was no trace of the heartbroken suburban wife. Looking in the mirror that morning, I saw K.L. Evans, consultant. A woman who was about to earn the biggest fee of her career. I arrived 15 minutes early. Arthur Vance met me in the lobby. In person, he was shorter than I expected but radiated a gruff, old-world power. His face was a roadmap of stress, with deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. He gave me a firm, dry handshake. "Evans," he grunted. "Glad you're here. The board is waiting." He led me down a long, wood-paneled hallway lined with portraits of his father and grandfather, a visual testament to the legacy he was about to lose. The air was thick with the smell of old money and new panic. He pushed open the heavy double doors to the boardroom, and I walked in. The room was cavernous, dominated by a long, polished mahogany table. Seated around it were a half-dozen men in suits, all of them looking grim. My eyes scanned their faces, cataloging them, preparing to put names to roles. And then, my gaze landed on a man sitting 2 seats down from the head of the table. My blood ran cold. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was Richard. He was wearing an expensive suit, looking every bit the corporate executive. He had a pen in his hand and a look of smug self-importance on his face as he laughed at something the man next to him had said. Then he looked up, sensing my presence at the door. His laughter died in his throat. His face, which had been ruddy and confident a moment ago, drained of all color. His jaw went slack. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock. It was a beautiful sight. The universe, it seemed, had a flair for the dramatic. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to me. Arthur Vance, oblivious to the personal cataclysm that had just detonated in his boardroom, gestured towards me. "Gentlemen, this is Catherine Evans of the K.L. Evans Group. She is the turnaround specialist I've hired. For the duration of her contract, her authority in matters of operational restructuring is absolute. She answers only to me." He then began to make the introductions, moving around the table. "This is Tom, our CFO. Frank, head of logistics." Each man nodded stiffly at me. I met their gaze with a cool, unreadable expression. Then Arthur's hand landed on Richard's shoulder. "And this is my VP of Special Projects, my son-in-law, Richard Miller." The words hung in the air. My son-in-law. The confirmation I didn't need but got anyway. I extended my hand towards Richard, my face a perfect mask of professional neutrality. "Mr. Miller," I said, my voice as crisp and cold as a winter morning. "A pleasure." He flinched as if my voice were a physical blow. He stared at my outstretched hand for a beat too long before taking it. His palm was damp and cold. His grip was weak. He couldn't form a single word. He just stared at me, his mind clearly scrambling to comprehend the impossible situation he now found himself in. I was no longer the wife he had discarded. I was the woman his father-in-law had just given absolute power to. And we both knew it. I took my seat at the table, directly opposite him, and opened my briefcase. The energy in the room had shifted. The standard boardroom tension was now charged with a new, personal electricity that crackled between me and my ex-husband. He couldn't take his eyes off me. His expression a chaotic mix of fear, disbelief, and a dawning horrified understanding. I, on the other hand, never looked at him again. I addressed the room. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. Gentlemen, I've had a chance to review the preliminary financials. To be blunt, the situation is critical." I clicked a button on my laptop, and the company's catastrophic cash flow chart appeared on the large screen at the end of the room. A collective wince went through the assembled executives. "We are burning through cash at an unsustainable rate. My job is not to assign blame for the past. My job is to ensure this company has a future. To do that, we need to make immediate, aggressive, and what some of you may consider painful, changes." I was in my element. The nervousness I'd felt in the car had evaporated, replaced by a cold, clear focus. This was a puzzle, a complex system on the brink of collapse, and I knew how to fix it. I began to go around the table, a methodical dissection of the company's failing organs. "Tom," I said, turning to the CFO, "your accounts receivable is lagging at 90 days. Why haven't we tightened our credit policies?" Tom, a harried-looking man with sweat beading on his forehead, stammered through an explanation about not wanting to alienate long-term customers. I cut him off, politely but firmly. "A customer who doesn't pay isn't a customer. They're a liability. We'll be implementing a new policy effective immediately." I turned to Frank, the head of logistics. "Frank, your freight costs are up 18% year-over-year, while your volume is down. Explain." He mumbled something about fuel costs. I countered with data on his fleet's inefficiency. I could feel Richard stare on me the entire time. He was watching the woman he had called just a housewife systematically dismantle his new colleagues with a level of expertise he had never bothered to acknowledge she possessed. Finally, I let my gaze drift over to him. "And you, Mr. Miller. You're the VP of Special Projects. Could you please outline the key projects your department is currently managing, their associated budgets, and their projected return on investment?" The silence stretched. All eyes turned to Richard. He cleared his throat, shifting in his expensive leather chair. "Well," he began, his voice strained. "We are, exploring a number of strategic initiatives. Blue sky thinking. It's about synergy and optimizing brand perception in emerging markets." It was a word salad of meaningless corporate jargon. He was floundering, and everyone in the room knew it. "I see," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "Could you be more specific? For example, what was your department's most significant contribution to revenue or cost savings in the last quarter?" He paled even further. He looked to his father-in-law for help, but Arthur Vance was watching me, his expression grim and unreadable. Richard had nowhere to hide. "The value isn't always quantifiable in the short term," he stammered. "It's about long-term positioning." I made a small note on my legal pad. The pen made a crisp, scratching sound in the silent room. "So, to be clear," I said, looking up at him, my eyes devoid of any emotion, "you are unable to provide a single concrete deliverable or financial metric associated with your role." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A death sentence. I saw a flash of the old, arrogant Richard then, a flicker of indignation in his eyes. "Now see here, Catherine," he started, using my first name, trying to pull rank from a past life. I cut him off instantly. "It's Miss Evans," I said, my voice like steel. "And I would remind you, Mr. Miller, that you are speaking to a consultant hired by your CEO to assess all aspects of this business, your department included." The rebuke was sharp, public, and utterly devastating. A faint flush of red crept up his neck. He sank back into his chair, defeated. I turned my attention back to the rest of the room, leaving him to stew in his public humiliation. "I will be conducting one-on-one operational reviews with each of you over the next 2 days. I expect you to come prepared with detailed reports on your department's function, budget, and personnel. My assistant will be sending out a schedule this afternoon." I closed my laptop with a decisive snap. "A preliminary restructuring plan, including recommended personnel and departmental consolidations, will be on Mr. Vance's desk by Friday. Thank you for your time, gentlemen." I stood up, gathered my things, and gave a brief, professional nod to Arthur Vance. As I walked out of the boardroom, I didn't look back at Richard. I didn't have to. I could feel the heat of his gaze on my back, a mixture of pure hatred and sheer terror. The game had changed. The power had shifted. And I was just getting started. My temporary office was a sterile, glass-walled space on the executive floor, overlooking the sprawling factory complex. It was a world away from my quiet suburban home. My assistant, a sharp young woman named Chloe, had my schedule for the one-on-one reviews laid out. Richard's was scheduled for the next day at 10 a.m. I knew he wouldn't wait that long. Sure enough, less than an hour later, there was a sharp knock on my office door. It was Richard. He closed the door behind him, his face a thunderous mask. The fear from the boardroom had been replaced by a familiar, blustering arrogance. "What the hell is this, Cat?" he hissed, his voice low and furious. "What kind of game are you playing?" I didn't look up from the report I was reading. "I'm not playing any games, Richard," I said, my tone cool and detached. "I'm doing my job. A concept you might want to familiarize yourself with." He recoiled as if struck. "You can't do this," he said, his voice rising. "You can't just walk in here and what?" I finally looked up at him, my gaze unwavering. "Hold you accountable. Expect you to justify your 6-figure salary. I can and I will." He began to pace the small office like a caged animal. He tried a different tactic, the one he had always used when he wanted something. He softened his voice, attempting to conjure the ghost of our shared past. Kat, come on. It's me. Think about what this looks like. Think about our history. You wouldn't do this to me. After everything we've been through. The audacity of it, to invoke our history, the history he had incinerated, was breathtaking. A cold, hard anger solidified in my chest. Let me be very clear, Richard, I said, standing up and walking around the desk to face him. I was calm, my voice never rising. The man I went through everything with wouldn't have thrown away 20 years for a 25-year-old's Instagram feed. The man I had a history with is gone. You are Mr. Miller, the VP of Special Projects. And I am Miss Evans, the consultant who is about to audit your entirely useless department out of existence. Your history doesn't get you a pass. In fact, it's the reason I know with absolute certainty that you are dead weight. He stared at me, speechless. The bluster, the arrogance, the false charm, it all fell away, leaving behind a man who looked weak and terrified. He tried one last, desperate ploy. Tiffany will be devastated, he whispered. Arthur would never. He would never let you fire me. We'll see, I said, turning my back on him and returning to my desk. Your appointment is tomorrow at 10. Please be on time. And bring your budget. If you can find it. He stood there for another moment, utterly defeated, then turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. The next morning he was there at 10 o'clock sharp. He looked like he hadn't slept. His expensive suit was rumpled, and his eyes were bloodshot. He sat down opposite me, a single sad-looking folder in his hands. The one-on-one was a clinical, brutal affair. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply questioned him with the dispassionate curiosity of a scientist studying a particularly inert specimen. Let's start with your Q3 projects, I began. He opened the folder. It contained a few glossy printouts of potential marketing slogans and a list of influencers they could potentially collaborate with. There were no timelines, no budgets, no metrics for success. It was fluff. A high school marketing club could have produced a more substantive report. What was the budget for this blue sky thinking, Richard? Yes. He mumbled a number that made my eyebrows shoot up. It was an astronomical sum, enough to have funded the raises for the entire factory floor for a year. And where did that money go? Press. He stammered about travel, entertainment, retaining a brand strategy visionary, who was one of Tiffany's friends. I typed notes into my laptop, my face unreadable. I asked him about his team. He had 2 direct reports, both of whom I had discovered were distant cousins of his wife. I asked for their performance reviews. He didn't have any. The entire 45-minute meeting was a systematic dismantling of his position. I asked pointed, data-driven questions to which he had no answers. Every stammered reply, every vague justification, was another nail in his professional coffin. By the end, he was slumped in his chair, a man completely and utterly exposed. Closed my laptop. Thank you for your time, Mr. Miller. That will be all. He didn't even have the energy to be angry anymore. He just nodded numbly and left my office. On Friday morning, I walked into Arthur Vance's office with a 10-page report and a heavy heart. Not for Richard, but for the man I was about to put in an impossible position. Arthur sat behind his massive oak desk, looking old and tired. Don't sugarcoat it, Evans, he said, gesturing for me to sit. How bad is it? I laid the report on his desk. It's salvageable, I said. But only with immediate and decisive action. The plan is all in there. It involves closing the Dayton plant, which is losing over $1 million a quarter. It involves a complete overhaul of your supply chain management. And it involves the elimination of several executive positions that are a drain on resources with no discernible return. He picked up the report and flipped through it, his expression grim. He stopped on page 8, the personnel section. He read the list of recommended eliminations. His son-in-law's name was at the very top, next to a brief, brutal summary. Position, VP Special Projects. Finding, redundant. Cost center with no verifiable ROI. Recommendation. Immediate termination. Arthur let out a long, heavy sigh. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "He's my daughter's husband," he said, his voice quiet. "He's family." He wasn't looking at me, but at a framed picture on his desk. I could see it from my angle. It was of a beaming Tiffany in a wedding dress, with Richard by her side. "I understand this is difficult, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "But you didn't hire me to manage your family dynamics. You hired me to save your company. This company, your legacy, is on life support. That position, and the salary that goes with it, is a luxury you cannot afford. It's a symbol to the rest of your employees of the waste and nepotism that has brought this company to its knees. If you want them to believe in this turnaround, to make the sacrifices that will be required of them, the cuts have to start at the top. With the fat, not the bone." I let the words hang in the air. I had laid out the cold, hard logic. The choice was his. His legacy, or his daughter's feckless husband. He sat there in silence for a long time, staring at the report. Then he looked up at me. His eyes filled with a weary, pained resignation. He picked up a heavy, expensive pen from his desk. "All right, Evans," he said, his voice a low growl. "Let's do it." The following Monday the axe fell. Arthur Vance called a company-wide meeting, stood before his employees, and announced the restructuring plan. He was honest, brutal, and for the first time in years he sounded like a leader. He announced the plant closure, the budget freezes, and the elimination of redundant executive roles to streamline the company. He didn't name names, but the message was clear. An hour later, Richard was called into Human Resources. I saw him walk down the hall from my office window. He walked in with a swagger, but he shuffled out like a broken man, carrying the proverbial cardboard box filled with a few personal trinkets. The word spread through the company like wildfire. The unfireable VP, the boss's son-in-law, was gone. It sent a shockwave through the corporate culture. For the first time in a long time, there was accountability at Vance Manufacturing. The move, as painful as it was for Arthur personally, earned him a new level of respect from his staff. They saw that the sacrifice was being shared, that the old ways were truly over. My work was just beginning. Over the next few months, I was a whirlwind of activity. I practically lived at the factory, working side by side with the department heads to implement the changes. We renegotiated supplier contracts, redesigned workflows, and invested in new technology. It was grueling, exhausting work, but it was also the most fulfilling work of my life. I was watching a dying giant slowly, painfully, come back to life. The numbers started to turn. The cash flow bleed slowed, then stopped, then began to reverse. A quiet optimism started to spread through the company. Arthur Vance became my shadow. He'd watch me, a mixture of awe and respect in his tired eyes. He had hired a consultant, but he'd gotten a commander. He never mentioned Richard or Tiffany again. It was an unspoken understanding between us. We were focused on the future, not the past. I received a furious, rambling email from Tiffany a few days after the firing. It was a torrent of misspelled accusations and childish rage. She called me a vindictive old hag who was jealous of her youth and her marriage. She threatened to ruin my reputation. I read the email, a small, sad smile on my face, and then I deleted it without a reply. She was irrelevant. Her anger was the impotent tantrum of a spoiled child who had just had her favorite toy taken away. The real fallout was in Richard's world. The news of his unceremonious firing rippled through our old social circle. The story, as I heard it from Sarah, was that the brilliant new consultant his father-in-law had hired had uncovered his incompetence. The whispers painted him not as a victim, but as a fraud who had finally been exposed. His humiliation was complete. 6 months after I first walked into that boardroom, my contract with Vance Manufacturing was coming to an end. The company was stable, profitable, and had a clear path forward. Arthur offered me a permanent, high-level executive position, but I politely declined. I was a builder and a fixer. My work here was done. The K.L. Evans Group was thriving, with a waiting list of new clients. I had built my own thing and I wasn't giving it up for anyone. On my last day, Arthur walked me to my car. "I don't know how to thank you, Evans," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just save my company. You saved my family's name." "You saved your company, Arthur," I corrected him. "You just needed someone to show you the way." We shook hands, a new and genuine respect between us. A few weeks later, Sarah took me out to a celebratory lunch at a chic downtown restaurant. We were seated at a prime table by the window, sipping champagne, laughing about the sheer insanity of the past year. I felt lighter than I had in decades. I was successful, I was independent, and I was happy. Truly happy. As I scanned the restaurant, my eyes landed on a familiar couple seated in a dark corner. It was Richard and Tiffany. The contrast between our tables was stark. Sarah and I were animated, joyful. They were silent, surrounded by an aura of gloom. Tiffany was sullenly scrolling through her phone, completely ignoring the man beside her. Richard wasn't looking at his phone. He was staring into his water glass. His shoulders slumped. He looked diminished, older. He had aged 10 years in the last 6 months. The swagger was gone, replaced by the quiet desperation of a man who had lost his meal ticket. He must have felt my gaze, because he looked up and our eyes met across the crowded room. There was no anger in his expression, no hatred, just a hollow, aching regret. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't offer any sign of triumph. I simply held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a polite acknowledgement you might give a stranger. Then I turned back to Sarah, back to my champagne, back to my life. He no longer had the power to affect me. His presence was nothing more than a minor disturbance in my peripheral vision. That, I realized, was the truest revenge of all, utter and complete indifference. Looking back on it all now, the journey was a baptism by fire. The woman who walked out of Vance Manufacturing for the last time was not the same woman who had wept on her living room floor a year and a half earlier. The betrayal that I thought had destroyed me was actually the catalyst for my rebirth. I didn't set out to get revenge on Richard. Revenge is a hot, messy, emotional pursuit. What I got was something far more satisfying: justice. It wasn't personal. It was professional. He was a liability, and I eliminated him. My success wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was right. Right to believe in my own abilities, right to demand respect, and right to build a life on my own terms. The ultimate lesson I learned is that your value is not determined by who leaves you, but by what you build in their absence. Being underestimated became my superpower. While he saw a discarded wife, the world eventually saw a brilliant consultant. And most importantly, I finally saw myself again. So what do you think? Was I right to take the job, knowing who my ex-husband's new father-in-law was? Or was it an unprofessional conflict of interest? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if my story resonated with you, if you've ever had to pick yourself up and start over from scratch, please share your own story of resilience. This community is a place for us to remind each other just how strong we are. Don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed this journey with me. And please subscribe to the channel for more stories about turning life's biggest challenges into its greatest triumphs. Thank you so much for listening. Remember that sometimes the people who push you down are just giving you the leverage you need to spring back up, higher than ever before. I wish you all the strength and clarity you need on your own journeys.